Do you struggle with feeling exercises in the wrong muscle? Or maybe you go in and you do an exercise and you know you're supposed to feel it somewhere, but for some reason that particular muscle never feels like it's getting worked, and one of the other muscles that you're not supposed to feel it in is usually where you feel it. This is a really common complaint from people with Ehlers-Danlos'er and hypermobility. It's not exclusive to EDS people or hypermobile people. Other people can experience it too. But it seems to be something that we consistently experience with hypermobility, no matter what level you're at. I'm a pretty highly trained person and I still get this. So today we're going to discuss some strategies that we can do to work around this or to overcome this. And this will hopefully give you some strategies that you can apply in your own training. Now, this is an episode of Bendy Strong. I'm not going to lie, I've forgotten to look up which number episode it is, but I'll fill it in the title, so it's okay. But this is an episode of Bendy Strong. Some of you will be watching on YouTube. Some of you will be listening on a podcast app. Either way, I'm glad to have you here. Welcome along. So the usual disclaimer that we start off with in the Bendy Strong podcast is that this is not medical advice. You have to get clearance from a good doctor or physio before you start doing any new kind of exercise, and don't do anything that causes pain, clicking or clunking. We only ever want to be doing pain-free exercise, preferably under supervision of someone that we know and trust who understands Ehlers-Danlos'er and hypermobility. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get stuck into this topic for today. So the first thing I'm going to say to start off with is that we don't actually always have to feel things in certain muscles. Now, this is a little bit of a nuanced thing. It can be hard for me to just give you a really quick, hard and fast overview of this exercise you do, this exercise you don't. But let me give you some examples. For a deadlift, for example, if we're trying to lift heavy on a deadlift, I've actually seen people make the mistake of really trying to feel it in their glutes and feel it in their glutes. And this actually pulls them out of position slightly or makes the technique worse. So there are some exercises where we don't need to feel it in certain muscles, and other exercises where it's probably good to have some kind of what we call mind-muscle connection for that exercise. Where's the line? It's really hard to draw. The more experience you get, the more you're going to be able to draw this line for yourself. As a general guideline, if we're training for strength, if it's an exercise that's a big compound movement where we're using multiple joints and the goal is to lift efficiently and in a really strong and safe way, we probably don't want to be thinking, oh, I want to feel it in my glutes or in my quadriceps or in any particular muscle. We want to be focusing on the movement. Whereas if it's an isolation exercise designed to, say, hit the glutes, yeah, we want to be feeling that muscle working. But just because we don't feel it working doesn't mean it's not working. That's another disclaimer I have to give. So this is a little bit, the start of this discussion is a little bit back and forth with these different ideas, contrasting ideas. But once we get past this, we'll get into the actual strategies, and then it's going to be a lot easier and more straightforward. So hopefully that's starting to make a little bit of sense. You don't always have to feel it in a certain muscle. In fact, with certain styles of training, certain exercises, that can actually be detrimental to focus too much on feeling it in that one particular muscle. However, there are some exercises where it can be good to do that. Usually, if I'm training someone, I'll explain that to them. I'll say to them, hey, this is not an exercise where we need to feel it in these muscles. We just want to focus on technique. Whereas this other exercise, yeah, we do maybe want to feel it. And this is the particular muscle that we want to feel it in. Now, on the other side of that, you might struggle with feeling it in the wrong muscle. So you might say, hey, whenever I do a deadlift, I feel it in this area, just the left side of my low back. And I'm not feeling it in other places, just in my adductor on my right leg, and I'm not feeling it in any other places. You might say that when you do an overhead press or a lateral raise, you feel it just in your trap muscles, your upper trap muscles. That's something that we can also listen to. So it's not an absolute piece of data that you're absolutely doing the exercise wrong, but it is a piece of information that we can listen to. And that's a really common complaint for people with Ehlers-Danlos and hypermobility when they're doing strength training. So with all of that out of the way, let's say you're doing an exercise where we are trying to feel it in a particular muscle, or we're trying to avoid feeling it in the wrong muscles. In the example of a deadlift or something, you keep feeling it in the wrong muscle. What are some strategies that we can do? Well, I've written this out as a 4-step approach. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see it on my whiteboard behind me. But if you're listening, don't worry, I'm not going to miss anything out for all of you. I'll go through them each one by one. And the way that I've actually come up with these is if someone came to me as a client, this is the approach I would take. And actually, this is a question that someone asked in my Bendy Strong course. And this is the step-by-step approach that I gave them in response to that question. So the first thing I've got on the list is making sure that the person is doing this movement with the right technique. So they say, hey, I'm feeling it in the wrong muscle. I'm doing a hip thrust and I feel it in my low back, always in my quads, my hamstrings, my hip flexors, my low back. The first thing I'll get them to do is to demonstrate the exercise for me. Are we doing it with the right technique? And what's the right technique well, there's some sort of standards that we can aim for. It is going to vary slightly from person to person, different lever systems, different strengths, different weaknesses. But the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make some adjustments to the technique to make sure that you're doing it properly. Unfortunately, I can't cover this in this video because this would require me to list out every single exercise possible and teach you the right technique for them. But hopefully this can give you a starting point of, okay, if I'm not feeling it in the right muscle for this exercise, maybe I can go to a coach and talk to them and ask if the technique is right, make sure the coach understands hypermobility, or have a bit of a deep dive online and see if I can find a better technical way to execute this exercise. This is why I post a lot of technique stuff on my social media so that you can start to wrap your head around it. And shameless plug for my Bendy Strong course, we go over in-depth technique across the whole course. So you will get a lot of technique knowledge in the Bendy Strong course. But anyway, shameless plug over, back to the topic of today's video. The first thing I'll look at is the technique. Now, there's all these arguments online, perfect technique, where is it? What is it? I'm not saying that there is one perfect technique, but let's just say that someone is coming in, they're not feeling it in the right muscles. A good percentage of the time, the technique that they're doing is actually favoring another muscle. With Ehlers-Danlos'er and hypermobility, we are so masterful at adapting, and our bodies can compensate in really clever ways so that we really feel a different muscle working from what we're supposed to be using. So understanding technique, but not just technique, but technique for a hypermobile person and where those compensations tend to happen, that's the first thing that I'll look at, and fixing those. Now, in a lot of cases, this is going to fix the problem and is, oh, cool, I feel it in the right muscle now. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes you can be doing the most perfect technique, but you're still not feeling it in the right muscles. And this is a generalization, but I often see this with more advanced lifters, not to say that it won't happen with beginner lifters as well, but with advanced lifters, we are often really good at making things look great, but maybe relying slightly on the wrong muscles to do that. Again, Ehlers-Danlos bodies, hypermobile bodies, very good at compensating, very masterful. And the masterful compensation means not only are we really quick to resort to doing the compensations, but we're also often quite good at making it look like we're not compensating. So having the know-how with technique is the first step, but that's not always going to fix it. Sometimes we need to actually go in and get certain muscles firing, which brings us to the second step or second thing that I'll look at when it comes to fixing someone's complaint of feeling it in the wrong area or not feeling it in the right area. And that is this term called post-activation potentiation. Now, if you're seeing this on YouTube, you'll see on the whiteboard behind me, I've shortened it to PAP, which is a common abbreviation for this term. Post-activation potentiation, again, this is something we go over a lot in my Bendy Strong course, so if you've graduated from that course, you'll know all about this. It is a game changer when it comes to Ehlers-Danlos. And in fact, I've asked for feedback from some of the people who've completed the course, and even from people who've been training for a really long time. They said, I'd never heard of PAP. That changed my whole approach to exercise. And that really was a game changer in managing my Ehlers-Danlos symptoms. So what is PAP? Post-activation potentiation. Let's look at the word potentiation for a second. What does potentiation mean? So potentiation means we do something now to improve or amplify the effect of what we're about to do. So in strength training, it's used a lot, this term post-activation potentiation. It means that we're activating the muscle, and then after that activation, that muscle is more potentiated or ready to be used, ready to work, ready to kick in. So if you're finding that you're chronically having an underactive muscle, for example, the glutes, you don't feel them in anything, you always feel it in the other muscles, your glutes won't grow, and you've been told maybe by a rehab specialist, you've got weak glutes and we need to strengthen your glutes in order to fix some of the pain or manage some of the pain or improve your movement. This is when we can start to look at post-activation potentiation. So what we do with this is we find an exercise that you can't do wrong. I've said that Ehlers-Danlos body is a masterful compensator. Let's break this whole thing down and break it into the most fundamental movement. I can almost guarantee you there will be some kind of glute movement out there that you can do that will actually activate the glute. And what we do is we do that first. Then what happens is that muscle is a little bit more ready to fire. It's a little bit more ready to contribute to an exercise. It's got a little bit of a pump, but it's not just a physical feeling of, oh, I can feel a bit of a pump in this muscle, I can feel I've worked it, but actually neurologically the body is more primed to use that muscle. So we activate it, and then we go into another exercise where we're maybe slightly less likely to get it right. It's not as foolproof as the previous exercise we did, but that glute muscle is working a little bit harder. It's ready to work harder. And so in the bigger compound exercise or more complex exercise, it's going to contribute a lot better if we do this correctly. So post-activation potentiation, this changed the way that I warm up for my strength training sessions. What I go in and I do is I activate these muscles that usually tend to be underactive. And with Ehlers-Danlos, a pattern that we see is the postural muscles or the smaller supporting muscles. They are often the ones that tend to be a bit more underactive. We go in, we activate those as part of the warm up, and then we go through our session and we have significantly less pain. We have better technique because we're relying on these supporting, stabilizing muscles a bit more. They're more reliable. So this is a technique that we can use if you really struggle to feel the right muscle working when you're doing a bigger compound exercise. For example, if you're doing a hip thrust, you never feel it in your glutes. You only ever feel it in your low back, hamstrings, adductors, quads, whatever it is. You do a glute activation, a really isolating glute activation exercise first. And this is where you might really just have to really focus on doing it right. And then you go and do the big exercise like a hip thrust and the glute muscles are more ready to contribute. Or it might be that you get your lats activated before you do some upper body exercise so that you're less likely to rely on these overactive upper traps and you can use the right muscles to perform this exercise. So post-activation potentiation is one of my favorite techniques to use. And if you're struggling with feeling it in the wrong muscle or not able to feel it in the right muscle, we can use this technique to actually get the right things activated and hopefully deactivate some of the wrong muscles along the way as well. Now, I'm not intending for this video to be such a shameless plug for my course, but there's a reason that I built the course out how I did. It includes a lot of post-activation potentiation exercises that you can do, common deficits that people with Ehlers-Danlos have that lead to us feeling it in the wrong muscles, and techniques for overcoming that. So if you want to know a little bit more about how to actually utilize this, I've got my course, the Bendy Strong course, or I post heaps on my social media. So my Instagram, I'm going to start posting more of those videos on my YouTube as well, now that YouTube have lengthened the shorts that you're allowed to post. TikTok, it's not quite as comprehensive as in my course, but if you don't have the full 16 weeks to dedicate to the course, that's another option as well. So a lot of the time I find fixing the technique and using this post-activation potentiation technique does a lot for someone. If they're feeling it the wrong muscle or they can't feel a certain muscle working, it really gets you a long way. The third technique is what I use when we're starting to integrate this into a bigger exercise. The thing that I've described this as is training wheels or a refocus tool. So this is going to take a little bit of explaining to show you exactly what I mean. A technique that I really love to use if a certain muscle is just not contributing how it should is to add in a band or something of that sort to force that muscle to work. For example, if I'm doing squats and I want my hip abductors to be a little bit more contributing to the movement or my hip external rotation muscles, I might pop a band around my knees and I perform the squat with the band around my knees to get those muscles a little bit more ready to contribute. It's sort of like training wheels. Those muscles feel prompted to contribute because the band is there and the band's going to pull my knees in otherwise, so I have to push them out. So that's working my hip abductor muscles. And as a result, I then go and do the squat exercise. The band is actually triggering these muscles to keep contributing. So as I do the exercise, the muscles are a little bit more ready to contribute. They're a little bit more prompted to contribute. It's sort of like if you had a group assignment to do at university or at work, there's almost always one person who just doesn't pull their weight. And imagine if the boss or the university lecturer is sort of standing over them saying, hey, you need to pull your weight, you need to contribute. All of a sudden, the whole thing starts working a little bit better. Now, non-hypermobile, non-bendy people, a lot of the time will find that adding a band in like this will make it a little bit more challenging. For Ehlers-Danlos and hypermobile people, I often find it's the opposite. Adding a band in actually unlocks capabilities because these muscles are so underactive, maybe even the word hypertonic is the right word to use there. They're so not ready to contribute to the movement. So getting them a little bit more involved all of a sudden increases our force producing capacity of the exercise. So we're able to do a lot more with the exercise, but also it redirects the focus onto a certain muscle. Another example is a band around the knees doing a hip thrust, doing a leg press, any of these exercises to get those muscles working a little bit more. Now you can do this with an upper body exercise as well. Some people will put a band around their hands as they're doing a bench press or a shoulder press just to get those rotation muscles working a little bit better. So a band around our knees, around our hands, around our hips, whatever it is, that is one way to do this. And the idea is that the band is pulling us in a particular direction. We have to resist as we're doing the exercise. So we're forced to use those particular muscles. Another tool that we can use is reducing the range of motion. This can allow us a little bit more of that training wheel effect, because maybe we're able to maintain the right technique and to focus in on the muscle just for this much range, but not this much range. So reducing the range of motion, it's not always going to be the best option, but sometimes it may be an option that you can use under this category as well. Another thing that we can do is add a band in, but use it in a different way. So there's some exercises that you may have seen me post about on my social media. If you've done the Bendy Strong course, you'll have heard about them, but it's this idea of adding in a proprioceptive challenge. So proprioception is our body's awareness of where our body is in space. So there are these little proprioceptive organs which sit in our muscles and our joints, and they tell us where that joint is currently positioned. And then our brain uses that information to send back information to tell that area, the bigger muscles around that area, what they should be doing. So if we add a band in, but instead of using a band around our knees or around our hands or arms or whatever, we're actually adding the band in and we're holding onto the weight via the band. So an example of this is if you're doing a barbell overhead press, you've got the bar, and then you're adding the weights on. Instead of just popping plates on the bar, what you're actually doing is you're attaching a weight plate or a kettlebell via a stretchy band, putting that on where the plates would go rather than actually putting plates on. So what does this do? It makes a wobble effect. So this is a way of making an exercise a more proprioceptive challenge to that exercise. And what this can do is it can get some of those stabilizing muscles to contribute a little bit better. So it can help to reduce how much our, dysfunctional patterns are playing out in that exercise. So we have these dysfunctional patterns where we over rely on certain muscles and under rely on other muscles. So by getting a little bit more of the work directed through the muscles that we should rely on, it can help to relieve the muscles that we are relying on a bit too much. So if you always feel your upper traps during an exercise, if your knees hurt during a squat and your hip gets a bit funky, sometimes adding in this proprioceptive challenge can be a really nice way to redirect the focus in that exercise. And as well, using this proprioceptive idea, theoretically, it's also going to increase the sensory feedback, getting these proprioceptive organs a little bit more ready to send the information back to the brain. And in theory, that will then also help us from our brain to send out a better message to our muscles to move a little bit more efficiently. So that's another way that we can add in this training wheel or refocus effect to get certain muscles working a little bit better. Now, hopefully that made sense. If it didn't, that's okay. Come and do my Bendy Strong course. I explain it all a lot more in depth there. But if that doesn't make sense, just let me know in the comments and I can help to explain it. That's like a subcategory of another subcategory. So if you don't understand that one, that's okay. But what I do want you to understand is just this concept of a training wheel or a refocus tool so that we can refocus our attention on a certain area. Now, one other training wheel or refocus tool that we can use, there's lots of them, but another one that I've got listed out to mention here is actually to increase the load. Sometimes this will help. So you might find that you feel the wrong muscles working when you do a bodyweight squat, but add a weight onto your back and all of a sudden you can do it right. Now, this needs to be done with caution because we don't want to add load onto a dysfunctional movement, but sometimes you may find increasing the challenge of an exercise does help you to put a little bit more focus in. It's like the body wakes up and says, that's right, I need to do this correctly. Just be careful of that with more challenging, complex, or risky exercises. But for certain exercises, there are some different ones that I do in the gym where I do a suitcase carry. A suitcase carry is basically you hold the weight in one hand and do walks up and down a strip. And the idea is that it's challenging the postural muscles through the torso. For me, sometimes increasing the load on those helps to get the right muscles working a little bit better. That's not a tool for you to go out and use for every single exercise. But if you found before, sometimes going a bit heavier does help me to use the right muscles, that's sometimes why that has that effect. It helps you to refocus in and use those correct muscles, or the not necessarily correct, but the desired muscles that we want to use. Again, that's one that we need to use with caution. We do not want to add load to a dysfunctional pattern, but sometimes that can help our bodies to wake up and do the exercise a little bit better. Now, the fourth technique that I've got here on the list is actually to do another exercise. Sometimes we can try all of these things and we've done everything that we can, but we still feel the muscle in the wrong area. That's okay. With Ehlers-Danlos'er, we do have to be picky with our exercise selection sometimes, but also it doesn't always follow the most logical path that most coaches would think. because our bodies respond a little bit differently to things than non-hypermobile or non-Ehlers-Danlos bodies. So for me, I've been training for more than half my life now, and even I will find I'll go into the gym, I have the best intentions to get a particular exercise done, I go and I try it, I try all of these techniques, it still doesn't feel right. Okay, cool. I'm just going to try a different exercise to work that same movement pattern, or if I can't do the same movement pattern, to work the same muscles that I was trying to achieve a workout for in that exercise that I can't do. So we may have to choose a different exercise. On the whiteboard behind me, if you are watching on YouTube, you can see that under the first point that I've got here, I've actually got technique / a different exercise. This 4-step process, it's not necessarily one that I go through step by step. Maybe if you're just starting out, that's a good idea. As you get a bit more experienced, you'll get a little bit more intuitive. So if someone comes to me and they say, oh, I just struggle to feel this particular muscle working on this exercise, let's say an upright row. This is a really common problem exercise for Ehlers-Danlos people. I only feel it in my upper traps, or my elbow, or my wrist hurts. Let's just choose another exercise. That's a common problem exercise for Ehlers-Danlos. Not to say that you can never do it. And in fact, there have been some times in my training where that's been the best exercise for me. But we have these fluctuations with which exercises we can do. And I find that that one is more often than not one that I keep out of my rotation. There are some other exercises that may fall into this same category as well. For me, there's an exercise called dead bug, which uses your abs. You lie on your back with your shoulders at 90 degrees and your hips and knees at 90 degrees, and you extend arms and legs out. I find this one always, it just goes straight to my hip flexors. It's an exercise to work your abs. So what I do with that one, well, firstly, some people actually find that it helps if they add a band in, which is one of the techniques that I've used here. I've tried that, that still doesn't work for me. With a dead bug, if a client came to me and they said, I find a dead bug just doesn't work for me, I feel it in all the wrong places, I might not even want to take them through this process of figuring this out, because going through that process, we may trigger some, certain areas that we don't want to necessarily trigger. I know that's on the list of exercises in my head that is a common problem exercise for Ehlers-Danlos. So I will just swap another exercise out before we even go through this whole list. So that's why I've got the first point is technique / exercise. As you go through this, you become more intuitive with it. You'll be able to think, that's a problem exercise. That's a common problem exercise. Doesn't mean that we should reject all common problem exercises all the time, because like I said before, we can fluctuate with what we need. Sometimes certain exercises will be completely off the book for certain phases of your training, and then the next phase of your training, they're the one exercise that makes everything feel good. Ehlers-Danlos is weird, hard to explain, but that's what I mean. So we don't want to necessarily rule things out, but as you go through, you may become a little bit more intuitive and think, yeah, that's actually the exercise that often causes me problems. We want to keep an open mind, but also think, okay, you know what? Upright row, as an example, it's not even the best exercise for the shoulders. Like if you asked any bodybuilder, you'd be hard strapped to find one who says that's the number one exercise that grows my shoulders. And if you do find one, that was probably for just a particular phase of their training, and most of their shoulder growth was formed through overhead pressing, through lateral raises, etc. It's one of those exercises, it's not even the greatest exercise out there for shoulders, so I'll just swap it for something else. Same with dead bugs. I don't love it for abs. Even when you are doing it right and you're feeling in the right spot, it's not an irreplaceable exercise. It's one that we can swap out for another exercise. So that's the fourth point, but also kind of the first point. And once you get good at this, you can sort of jumble these up. You don't have to go through them in order. When you're starting out, maybe that's a good way to do it, but that is the way that I approach this whole complaint that I get from people with Ehlers-Danlos and hypermobility, a very valid complaint, a complaint that needs to be listened to and taken seriously of, I feel this muscle that I'm not supposed to be feeling, or every time I do a glute exercise, I just feel it in my low back or my adductors, my inner thigh muscles, or my quadriceps or something else. It's a very serious, not serious in a bad way, but it's a very helpful piece of information that we can get. And as coaches, or if you're coaching yourself, it's something we should listen to and play with, because it's useful information and there's all these different things that we can try to help alleviate it. And in the process, will actually help to facilitate more functional movement and more productive training. by getting the right muscles to work, we're going to be training in a more productive and efficient and in a way that allows us to achieve a little bit more with our training. So that's everything from me today. I hope this discussion was helpful for you. This was just a short episode or video if you're watching on YouTube. Hopefully it was helpful for you. Let me know, send me through a comment, or if you're listening on the podcast, I don't even know if there's a way for you to comment. I think I've allowed it so that you can actually send in feedback with fan mail or something. If you would like to, I would love it if you could subscribe to the podcast or subscribe to the YouTube channel, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment if you liked it. And if you're listening on a podcast app and you feel like leaving me a review, always happy to receive a good review. So no obligation to, just if you feel like it. Now, if you want to learn more about any of this stuff, I've mentioned it throughout. I've got my Bendy Strong course. Depending on when you're listening to this, we may be ready to launch another one, or we may be in the midst of a course, a cohort. At the moment, as I'm recording this is January, and I'm launching a course on the 27th of January. If you're overseas, it'll be the 26th. If you're in Australia, it'll be the 27th. This course will run for 16 weeks. There's different pricings available. As much as possible, I want to make everything that I do as accessible as possible for different people. So if you can afford it, it's $25 Australian per week. If you can't afford it, I have free and discounted spots available. So if you say, hey, I can just afford $10 a week, cool, we can set you up with this $7.50 a week subscription. There's lots of options available. I want to make this as accessible as possible. So if you want to learn more about any of that, Bendy Strong course. Otherwise, follow me on my social media platforms or tag them below in the description here. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining me. As always, we only ever want to train pain-free and clicking and clunking free. And now that we've done this video, we can actually add to that list feeling things in the right area. We're not compulsively feeling things in this, in our low back, or in one side of our low back, or in our tight adductors or our upper traps or our jaw or whatever it is. We want to start to redirect the focus onto the right muscles so that we can start making some serious progress in our training. And that is all for me. So thank you for joining, and I'll see you all next video or next podcast episode, whichever it is that you're listening this on.